Already.
All right, well, welcome everyone to our herb production workshop tonight. My name is Anna Meadows, and I'm an outreach coordinator for Springfield Community Gardens. We're a nonprofit based in Springfield, Missouri, whose vision is a world where everyone has access to healthy local food. This workshop on herbs for fun and profit is part of a larger workshop series on regenerative agriculture topics and is generously sponsored by the USDA NIFA CFP grant program. Let me break that down for you for a second. So that's the National Institute of Food and Agriculture's Community Food Projects Grant Program under the Department of Agriculture. And our speaker tonight is Patrick Byers. He's a regional horticulture field specialist with University of Missouri Extension. And I'm excited to let him introduce himself further in just a moment. But before we get started, a few housekeeping things. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please ask as we go. If you look at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button that you can press and type in your questions throughout the presentation. We'll be stopping periodically to chat with Patrick about them. There's also a chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Please only use this for comments, which helps me keep track of questions versus comments throughout the night. So that would be helpful to me. Also, once we leave this workshop, a screen will pop up with a link to a post-workshop survey. This survey is used in SCG's reporting to the USDA and also helps us provide meaningful workshops to all of you in the future. So we'd appreciate it if you could take a few moments to fill that out after this workshop ends. And if you have to leave early or you missed something during it and you'd like to refer to this workshop later, it will be available on SCG's Agriculture Workshop playlist on our YouTube channel by the end of the week. I'll put that link as well as our website, social media, and tonight's exit survey in the chat in just a moment. And that's it from me. Patrick, thank you so much for being here tonight. Welcome.
Hey, thank you, Anna. And it is indeed a pleasure to be with you here tonight. As Anna mentioned, my name is Patrick Byers. I'm a horticulture field specialist with the University of Missouri Extension, and I'm based in Webster County. And I've worked with specialty crop farmers, fruit and vegetable farmers for many years. And I'm excited about the potential that herbs have to become a profit center, a profitable crop for our farmers. Now, you'll notice the title of the webinar is Herbs for Fun and Profit. Now, we'll be emphasizing the profit side of things tonight, but there's some fun things about herbs that I'll be talking about as well. And as Anna mentioned, we'll be pausing frequently for questions. So if you have a particular favorite herb that we cover and you'd like to learn more about it, please reach out and let us know what your questions might be, and we will certainly tackle those. And there may be some herbs that we don't have time to cover. I'll be honest, I've chosen the herbs that in my estimation have the most potential for commercial production to really delve into tonight. But there are other possibilities. And if you'd like to talk about those, that'd be great as well. So I think with that, Anna, we will go ahead and get started with the presentation. And then following the PowerPoints, I'll have a short video for you on harvesting herbs. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, Anna, can we see the presentation?
You can see it.
Okay. Let me hide these floating meeting controls. There we go. Okay, so our focus tonight is going to be on commercial herb production. Those herbs that, again, based on the experiences of farmers here in Missouri, have reasonable potential for profitable production. And we'll be going through first some general introductory material. Then we'll be focusing in on a select group of herbs that, again, experience has shown us do hold good potential for profit. Again, just to reinforce what Anna said, this workshop is a partnership. Springfield Community Gardens is the lead organization, and myself as a University of Missouri Extension field specialist collaborating with Springfield Community Gardens. And of course, the vision of Springfield Community Gardens is a community where everyone has access to healthy local food. And then our other partner is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And particularly those of you who are farmers or prospective farmers, reach out to the USDA. Oftentimes, the entry point is the local County Farm Services Agency office. Stop by, get to know the USDA staff there. You'll learn more about programs available through the Natural Resources Conservation Service, through the Rural Development Program, and also through the Risk Management Agency. And then as far as internet-based resources, the farmers.gov website has a wealth of information that is of interest to farms of all scale, small farms as well as large farms. I am a University of Missouri Extension specialist. I have a farm in Webster County as well. So I've seen both sides of the potential for herbs. And of course, that note there, a guy who really enjoys growing and using herbs, I'm holding a tray of dill seeds there that I recently dried. But all of my career, and in fact, dating back to when I was a child, I've been interested in herbs. First of all, of course, they're fascinating plants with their different appearances, fragrances, colors, all the things that go into making interesting plants. And then as an extension specialist with the potential that they hold for our farmers to become profit centers on our farms. So here is our outline. This is what I hope to do tonight. First, a bit of an introduction to herbs. Then we'll talk about some of the challenges to growing herbs profitably in Missouri, some general information on herb production, and then we will delve into a select group of herbs. And in each of these herbs, we'll talk about the cultivars, we'll talk about propagation methods, we'll talk about herb culture, and then we'll talk about harvest and post-harvest handling of the herbs. And then we'll finish up with some thoughts on herb marketing. So what is an herb? I think it's good to define this right off the bat. And there are many plants that they can qualify as herbs based upon this definition, a plant or part of a plant valued for its medicinal, culinary, or other qualities. But again, we're focused on those herbs that, yes, they offer these potential, but they also are well enough known that they offer good profit potential. Now, some of these herbs are annuals, meaning that they're planted every year. Others are biennial, where they may be planted in one year and yield a harvest in the first and second year. In the second year, they flower, produce seed, and then that herb dies. Some are perennial. These are herbs that are hardy. They will come back year after year here in Missouri, and an initial planting might last 10 or 15 years. And then we have a group of herbs that are half hardy. Yes, they're perennials, but they're tender enough that a cold Missouri winter might damage them, or in some cases even kill them. So again, we have herbs that fall into all of these categories. And we'll talk about whether, as we get into the specific herbs, which ones are annuals, biennials, perennials, or half-hardy perennials. Now, how do we use herbs? Well, from the standpoint of the market for herbs, at the moment, the primary market here in Missouri is for culinary herbs. These are herbs that are used as seasonings in food. Now, obviously, we think of Italian cuisine, but there are many regional and national cuisines that are associated with specific herbs. I mean, what would, again, Italian cuisine be without basil and oregano? What would Indian cuisine be without cilantro? So again, there are herbs that are associated with specific cuisines, and then there's herbs that are just plain good in almost every setting. Herbs are also used in teas and beverages. We have a group of aromatic herbs that are becoming increasingly popular. Lavender is leading the charge here, but there's others as well. Then we have herbs that are grown for the extraction of essential oils. And then we have a group of herbs that, again, offer medicinal benefits. I'm not going to spend much time on medicinal benefits, but many of the herbs that are used in a culinary setting or for teas, beverages, or other uses also have medicinal qualities associated with them. Now, here is the select group of herbs that we are going to hone in on tonight. They include basil, cilantro, dill, lavender, marjoram, mint, oregano, parsley, rosemary, sage, and thyme. So sit back and enjoy the show. We'll get into these specific herbs here in just a moment. Now, I promised to share some challenges. There are some challenges to growing herbs on a commercial scale and to grow them profitably here in Missouri. Missouri is characterized by wet springs and winters, and a number of herbs are native to Mediterranean climates where the winters and the springs are not wet. They tend to be dry and warm, and unfortunately, a wet spring and a wet winter can actually be very difficult, very detrimental to herb growth. Cold winters, we have some herbs that just are not hardy enough to endure the cold weather that we can sometimes see in Missouri. Some herbs are not particularly well suited to hot summers. We all know that Missouri can experience hot summers. Humidity. So humidity is part of the reality of the growing season here in Missouri. And a number of herbs really are adapted to more of an arid climate, and they can suffer during extremely humid periods. Clay soils tend to be heavy, tend to have issues with internal drainage. Most herbs do best on lighter, well-drained soils. Now, we can modify clay soils, we can make them suitable for production, but again, we have to recognize that this is necessary for profitable production of some of our herbs. Missouri, of course, is zone 5 to 6, and again, this can be a challenge for the more tender perennial herbs like rosemary, for example. And then pest pressures. We'll talk a bit about some pests as we get into the specific herbs, but herbs such as basil suffer from a disease called downy mildew. Downy mildew can be particularly serious in a hot, humid summer, which of course is to be expected here in Missouri. Now, how can we overcome these challenges? Well, again, the first step is site selection. We always want to consider the attributes of the area in which we're going to grow the herbs. And if we identify a potential problem, let's modify it from the very beginning and overcome that problem. Some of the ways that we overcome these problems: raised beds. Growing herbs on raised beds is a time-honored way to grow herbs. Herbs, again, benefit from well-drained soils, and a raised bed, you're just about guaranteeing a well-drained soil. Many herbs will grow well in containers, and particularly if the native soil is a heavy soil and it's poorly drained, growing the herbs in a container can be the answer. I've seen extensive plantings of herbs such as lavender growing in containers. High tunnels. The high tunnel may be the answer to a cold spring. It may be the answer to the survival of half-hardy perennials during the winter. It can also help with spring, summer, and fall production because it can, in the tunnel environment, you manage the environment. You can make it suitable for herbs of interest. Greenhouse production. Greenhouse production in a structure that is heated or cooled can enable you to grow herbs that would not otherwise thrive under a typical Missouri growing season. And then frost blankets. These are spun bonded row covers that can be placed over herb plants to enable them to survive the winters here in Missouri. So again, there are ways that we can overcome some of those challenges that I mentioned earlier. Now, let's think about the possibilities of commercial herb production. Oftentimes, the starting point is field production. If we look at that lower picture there on the right, we can see my wife in a lavender field. This is a large-scale field production site for lavender. We can also grow herbs in field production with protection, using row covers or using even low or high tunnels. The upper picture on the right is an example of a high tunnel, where a variety of different herbs are under production. Greenhouse production, particularly with the more tender herbs, could be a possibility. And we have a number of herbs that are produced under hydroponic production settings. Basil, in particular, is well suited for growing in a hydroponic setting. Now, again, from the standpoint of an overview of herbs, we have to think about produce food safety. And this is an interesting graphic. It illustrates the produce items that have been associated with foodborne illness outbreaks. And in this case, it's outbreaks between 1996 and 2014. And if we look at the pie chart there, we'll notice that about 5% of the outbreaks during that period of time were related to contamination of herbs: basil, parsley, and cilantro. And we have to recognize that many herbs are consumed raw. They're not cooked before they're consumed. And so they do carry a risk of foodborne illness. And it's important when we think about growing herbs that we do so in such a way that it minimizes this particular risk. And I'll encourage anyone on the call who is thinking about commercial production of herbs to reach out. I can share with you information on trainings to help you understand produce food safety relative to herbs. So please do that. It's very important that we grow crops such as herbs in such a way that we minimize the risk of foodborne illness. Now, there are some herbs that are excluded from what's called the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. These herbs are not covered by this piece of federal legislation, and they include dill, the seeds and the weed. They include peppermint, ginger, and horseradish. All other herbs across the board are covered by the Produce Safety Rule. So again, it's important if you're thinking about commercial scale production of herbs other than dill, peppermint, ginger, and horseradish, that you recognize that they will be regulated or that they are subject to the regulations of the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule. Now, some general thoughts on growing safe herbs. First of all, if you do choose to use manure, use it properly. Use it in such a way that it doesn't come into contact with the harvested part of your herb crop. Typically, that's the seeds or the foliage. It's a good practice to observe a 120-day interval from when any manure is applied and the herbs are harvested. Excellent practice to use only potable water for herb production. Frequently when we water, we're going to unavoidably wet the herb plants, and using potable water removes the risk of contamination that's associated with non-potable water sources. Potable means that it's drinking water quality. And if you have questions about the quality of your water, by all means, get that water tested. And I'll mention now that here in 2021, we have available a program to help offset the cost of water tests for herb producers. So again, for more information on that, please reach out. And then handle herbs carefully at harvest. Make sure that you harvest them in such a way that you reduce the risk of cross-contamination. Make sure they're handled properly during post-harvest, and transport them properly to market to prevent cross-contamination. So again, some general thoughts. Much more information on growing and handling herbs in a safe fashion is available through the Produce Safety Alliance Food Safety Modernization Act trainings. So please reach out for more information on those trainings. Okay, now we're going to move into the fun part of our time together tonight, and that's actually growing the herbs. And I'm a bit of a botany geek, and I like to understand the relationships among different plants. And herbs are interesting. The majority of herbs come from two plant families. Those are the mint family and the parsley family. And they share common characteristics from the standpoint of the structure and the blossoms and the fruiting habit of the plant, but also the way that they're grown and the cultural requirements. The mint family, these plants all have square stems. So if you're working with an herb that has a square stem, it's a member of the mint family. This, of course, includes mints, but it also includes basil, oregano, marjoram, lavender, sage, thyme, and rosemary. The parsley family has an umbel-type floral structure. If you look at that picture of dill there in the lower picture, an umbel is a situation where the individual flowers, the clusters of flowers, are on stems that attach to a common point on the main stem. We can see that clearly in that dill flower. And other members of the parsley family include certainly dill, but also parsley, cilantro, fennel, and caraway. Now, what is a good soil for growing herbs? Well, that's a good question. And recognize that success or failure frequently is tied into the characteristics of the soil. A good initial point to start with from the standpoint of growing herbs is to conduct a soil test in the area in which you plan to plant your herbs. And the soil test will reveal information on the chemistry of the site, also the organic matter content, and the texture of the soil. These are all important pieces of data to help guide you in your decision to plant at that site, and also how to manage the soil in such a way that it is suitable for herb production. Keep in mind that the best flavor and aromatic profiles in herbs is directly related to the soil growing conditions. And a typical soil that is good for herbs is well drained, slightly acid to neutral with a pH of 6.0 to 7.0, and of moderate fertility. These are the soil characteristics that lead to herbs that are aromatic and have a high market value. Now, frequently we grow herbs on raised beds, and I mentioned why earlier. Here's an example of a lavender farm. And in this case, this farm had over 5 acres of lavender plants growing on raised beds. The raised beds ensure adequate soil drainage. And with an herb like lavender, which is very, very sensitive to wet soils, this is just about a requirement for growing lavender here in Missouri. So if you're thinking about lavender, we can talk more, but a good starting point is to plant it on a raised bed. Weed control is very important too. Herbs are not particularly competitive against weeds, and we have to recognize that weeds will rob your herb plants of sunlight, water, nutrients, and growing space. So we want to think about weed management, and using the approach of integrated weed management. This is a good common sense way to think about controlling weeds. It's a good idea to practice rotations with annual and biennial herbs. With an annual herb at the end of the production cycle, you can eliminate weeds that might be present. With perennial and biennial herbs, unfortunately, you can't eliminate all weeds because the herb plants are there as well. So you have fewer options. But if you rotate with annual plants, annual type herbs, you have that option to clear the area out after the production of the annual crop. Stale seed bedding is very helpful. This is a situation where a bed is raised and then weed seeds are allowed to germinate, and then the weed seeds the germinated weed seedlings are eliminated either through very shallow tillage, through flaming, through occultation, whatever approach you choose to use. And then the herb seeds or the herb transplants are planted back into that clean bed. Shallow tillage is helpful. Mulches are helpful. These might be organic mulches, or they could be plastic mulches, as we see in this picture here, or they could be weed barrier fabric mulches, as we saw in the previous picture with the lavender plants. There are a few herbicides labeled for use on herbs, but only a handful. And if you do decide to use a herbicide, make sure that you read the label carefully and understand whether or not that herbicide is labeled for use on herb plants. Irrigation is necessary for herb production on a commercial scale. Now, again, a good herb soil is well drained, but well-drained soils tend to dry out quickly, and you need to be prepared to irrigate if necessary. Drip or trickle is the standard way of irrigating herbs. Perennial herbs, you'll be using a more long-term type drip line. With annual herbs, you can use a thin-walled, collapsible plastic type drip line. But drip lines work very well with herbs, a very efficient use of water. They also reduce food safety risks because they don't get the herb plants wet. They reduce diseases, and they allow you to harvest at any time, even if you're running the drip system. Looking at this picture here, we can see basil plants growing in a bed setting with multiple drip lines. So again, drip lines can be a very helpful, very good way to irrigate herbs. Now, fertilization. In general, herbs are not heavy feeders. And in fact, over-fertilizing herbs typically results in plants that are excessively vegetative and have lower levels of the aromatics that we value in the herb plants. So don't over-fertilize. Typical total nitrogen needs for most herbs is 80 to 100 pounds per acre of nitrogen. And, again, compare and contrast that to a crop like tomatoes, where you might need 150 to 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre. So again, herbs are not heavy feeders. Don't over-fertilize herbs. Now, from the standpoint of exposure and sunlight, most herbs do best in full sun. There are a few, such as mints, which will grow in partial shade, but if given too much shade, this tends to mute the flavors of herbs. With most herbs, their full flavor profile and aromatic profile is developed in full sun. Now, keep in mind that herbs are not pest-free. Yes, many of them have a reduced pest pressure and they can be grown with little or no spraying, but it seems like with every herb, there's at least one or more pests that can be troublesome. There are some general pest issues like aphids and Japanese beetles, and then there's some that are specific like downy mildew on basil and parsley leaf spot. Looking at this picture here, we can see several generations of black swallowtail larvae on parsley. Now, again, I don't consider this a pest. In fact, I like to see butterfly caterpillars out there, but they are eating some of my harvest. And if there were too many, I would relocate them to an area where I wasn't as concerned about their feeding. Okay, now we're going to get into the specific herbs. And I will plan to pause after each of these herbs after I go through the material and ask if there's any questions. So this will be an excellent time to type any questions you might have related to mints into the Q&A box. And Anna will alert me to any questions that might be there. So the mints, they are botanically mentha, and there's, many, many different types of mints, over 600 varieties of mints. Most of them are perennials, some of them very long-lived perennials, but only a few of them are important commercially. Only a few of them really hold good profit potential here in Missouri. And these are the mints that, of course, that are widely known and have wide applications. And they include peppermint and spearmint. Pineapple mint is becoming increasingly popular. And there are others too. I'm hearing about types of mints such as mojito mint, which is being grown and marketed. But from the standpoint of wide-scale production, peppermint, spearmint, pineapple mint, those are the big three. Now, propagating mint. Mint can be propagated from seed, but seed-propagated mint, there's a lot of variability among the seedlings from the standpoint of the quality of the plants, meaning the fragrance and the aroma and the flavor. So it's a more general practice to propagate mints vegetatively. And typically they're propagated from stolons. And a stolon is a stem that has roots and shoots along its length. And if we look at that upper picture, that is a stolon of peppermint that I uprooted from my bed. And you'll notice that there are roots along its length. And in the lower picture, you can see where I've chopped it into pieces. And as long as there's a shoot and some roots, each of those pieces will generate a new plant. These are called divisions, and they're typically planted in the spring. But you can actually do divisions at almost any time during the growing season. Mints are not particularly sensitive or not particularly difficult to propagate. In fact, mints can be a bit invasive. And so oftentimes as you're working with mints, you'll be pulling them up to keep them from spreading into unwanted areas. And those stolons that you pull up can become your material for propagation. Now, again, mints are invasive, and you want to be thinking about how you can confine them to the production area that you're interested in. You can begin harvest just very quickly after planting. Those divisions will start to sprout, and before long, you've got shoots that can be harvested. So again, 4 to 5 weeks after planting, you can start light harvests. It's a good practice to cut mint beds back periodically, and this will lead to uniform stem growth. When we get to the video, you'll see my peppermint and apple mint beds, and how cutting back leads to a more uniform stem growth and makes harvest of uniform stems much easier. 2 or more beds can be helpful because then you can stagger harvests. Mints grow back pretty quickly after harvest, but there is a period of time after harvest before you can recut that bed. Now, you can fertilize mint beds when cutting them back. And then, again, you want to space your harvest every 1 to 2 weeks or perhaps even longer. Some mints are slower growing than others. But as we'll see here in the video, you typically want somewhere around 12 to 18 inches of stem growth, and you're going to harvest the upper part of the stem. And on the subject of harvest, from the standpoint of marketing, you want uniform lengths of stem. So the way that I harvest is I grasp stems in my hand, I hold them to uniform length, and I cut them. And then you want to tie bundles with rubber bands. And a bundle, there's a bundle kind of, how many stems are in a bundle, it's kind of up to you. But standard would be 25 stems per bundle. Keep in mind that the best quality is the top 4 to 6 pairs of leaves. When you get down to those lower leaves, they're older, they've lost quality, they're not as aromatic. It's the upper leaves that are of interest. Once you've harvested the mint, place it in poly bags and refrigerate immediately. And hold the harvested stems at about 38 to 40 degrees. And you want to hold them in water if you're going to hold them for any period of time, and at the base of the stems in water. Good practice with all of the herbs, if you're marketing them as fresh cut herbs, to market them as soon as possible after harvest. Okay, do we have any questions on mints?
Not on mints. We do have one from a little bit earlier, though.
Let's tackle it.
All right. It says, what is the result of using hydroponics to grow herbs? I've seen many people comment on the fact that hydroponics create a less desirable herb.
Well, the quality of the herb, and the primary herb we're talking about here is basil. The quality of the basil is directly dependent upon your skill as a hydroponic grower. The nutrient mix that you're using in your hydroponic system and the way that you manipulate the environment will have a direct bearing on the level of aromatics in the foliage of the basil plants. And yes, I've had some basil coming out of hydroponic production that is almost tasteless. And then I've had some that is very aromatic and very tasty. So again, it is directly related to the growing conditions under which it's produced. Sometimes I hear the comment, well, it's from hydroponics, it's not going to be good. But that's not the case. If it's grown well, it can be as tasty and as aromatic as basil coming from a soil bed. And so I'm not afraid of purchasing hydroponic grown basil if I know that it's been grown well.
All right, that's the only question we have right now.
Okay, well, let's move on to the next herb, which is oregano and sweet marjoram. Now, these two are perennials like the mints. They're in the mint family. Sweet marjoram is a fast-growing herb, and it's sometimes grown as an annual. It's a little bit less hardy than oregano, and in a cold winter, it won't come back as well as you would have hoped. So those farmers who are growing sweet marjoram as a crop consistently from year to year will oftentimes treat it as an annual. As far as cultivars, Greek oregano is the most widely grown. It's a very aromatic form of oregano. There are other types such as Italian, but by far Greek is the dominant form of oregano. There's a cultivar of sweet marjoram called Max, which is widely grown. But again, both of these herbs are production is straightforward, and it mirrors to some extent the production of mints, as we'll see here in a moment. Now, again, with oregano and sweet marjoram, they can be propagated from seed, but again, there's that issue of variability. And more frequently, oregano or sweet marjoram beds are developed from stem cuttings, root divisions, or layers. Now, stem cuttings, that's probably the fastest way to propagate it, but in order to succeed with that, you need specialized conditions under which to root the cuttings. And typically the cuttings are taken in the spring and they're rooted in a soilless medium, sometimes under mist. And yes, they'll root quickly and then you can establish the bed, but you have to have the right environmental conditions to get a good percentage of rooting on stem cuttings. Oregano and sweet marjoram are quite hardy. They'll do fine across Missouri. As I mentioned, though, that in an extremely cold winter, sweet marjoram might suffer. Raised beds work great with these herbs. Landscape fabric has been integrated with oregano and sweet marjoram production with good effect. With both of these types, the harvest takes place before flowering. But you can take a bed that is flowering, cut back the flowering stems, and encourage the production of a new crop of shoots that can be then harvested a little bit later on. And on the subject of harvesting, in general, oregano and sweet marjoram have lower yield potential than some of the other herbs we're going to discuss tonight. Does that mean you shouldn't try them? By no means. If you have a market for them, with that limited yield potential, they will bring a higher price. But recognize that the yield potential, for example, of a 10-foot by 2-foot oregano or sweet marjoram bed will definitely be lower than comparable production of most other herbs in that area of production. Harvest the stems in the spring when they're 6 to 8 inches tall. Harvest before flowering. And you can usually get 2 to 3 harvests. The initial harvest, and then you have regrowth. You can frequently get a second harvest and sometimes even a third harvest. But after that third harvest, then you let them then flowering, and then you cut them back after flowering for a late summer harvest. Typically, again, harvested in bunches of uniform length, 15 to 20 stems per bunch. Place them in poly bags with the tops open and refrigerate them immediately. Oregano and sweet marjoram are more perishable than mint, and they have to be handled carefully and marketed quickly. Okay, any questions on oregano or sweet marjoram?
No questions on oregano or sweet marjoram. We do have a separate question though.
Okay, let's tackle it.
Okay, it says, do you need separate varieties in the planting beds when planting?
You don't need separate varieties, but it is a good practice to keep your varieties separated because at harvest time, it's much easier to harvest a uniform product if you don't have, an intermingling of cultivars. This is especially the case with mints, which are, again, very invasive. And if you have several different types of mints in the same bed, sooner or later, you're going to have a mixed bed. And harvest becomes quite challenging in that setting. So in general, it's better not to mix herbs, as far as intermingling them within a bed. It just complicates production and harvest.
All right, that's the only question we have.
Okay, thank you. Okay, cilantro. Cilantro is Coriandrum sativum. It's an annual. There's a number of cultivars of cilantro. They include Santo, Slow Bolt, Longstanding, and Calypso. Cilantro is widely used in Latin American cooking and also in Indian and Asian cooking. Very interesting herb. It has 2 forms that are used, both the foliage but also the seeds as the herb coriander. So you can grow it. Primarily, it's grown for the foliage, but there is some market for coriander seed production as well. And here we see in this picture what the seed look like. Cilantro is propagated from seed. It's a cool climate annual. It does best during the cooler parts of the year. It can be planted in the early spring for spring and early summer harvests, or it can be planted in the fall for a very early spring harvest, or perhaps in the case of a long fall, even for a fall harvest. It's direct seeded. It's not transplanted because the plants don't transplant well. So direct seed cilantro. Now, again, it's a cool season annual. You want to seed it while the soil temperatures are cool, typically soil temperature of around 50 to 55 degrees. And it's oftentimes planted in bunches or rows. If you're planting it in the row, the eventual plant spacing should be about 2 to 3 inches apart, and your row should be about 10 to 12 inches apart. A good practice if you want an extended harvest of cilantro is to plant succession planting. So every 2 to 3 weeks, plant a new bed of cilantro. And a given bed will typically give you about 2 to 3 weeks of harvest from start to finish. And you finish bed 1, then you're ready to move on to bed 2, which is just now reaching its peak of quality. Cilantro is a quick turnaround crop, 50 to 55 days after seeding. and it has to be harvested before it begins to send up its flower stalk. When it sends up its flower stalk, the quality of the foliage declines. And again, you want to clip the foliage, the leaves, about 1.5 to 2 inches above the bed surface, or you can also pull the plants and wash the roots and bundle them up that way. I've seen entire cilantro plants marketed that way. Typically, again, they're marketed in bunches, and on large-scale cilantro production, they're harvested and put into what are called field crates. And a field crate has 100 bunches, and again, you can see in this picture here what a bunch of cilantro would look like. And typically per acre, you'll have 100 to 200 field crates. It's a productive crop. It should be stored at fairly cool temperatures at high humidity, and it has about a 2-week shelf period. But again, as is the case with most fresh harvested herbs, try to market it as quickly as possible after harvest. Okay, any questions on cilantro?
We have a question on oregano.
Okay.
Okay. It says, can oregano grown in containers survive winter in Missouri?
Oregano in containers is problematic here in Missouri. And personally speaking, I've tried to grow it in large containers and had issues with it surviving the winter. So again, at least nominally, it's hardy enough, but it's probably best grown as a plant in the soil and perhaps even grown with some winter protection.
All right, thank you. That's our only question.
Yep, very good. Okay, now let's talk about dill, Anethum graveolens. It's an annual, and we have a number of cultivars: Bouquet, Ducat, Fernleaf, and Mammoth. Mammoth has been the standard cultivar for many, many years, but I'm kind of excited about Ducat, which is a highly aromatic form of dill, and particularly for applications such as dill pickle production. This is an excellent cultivar. Now, dill is seed propagated, and again, it has a long taproot, should not be transplanted, it should be direct seeded. Dill and coriander share that characteristic. If you're growing dill with the idea of marketing it for dill pickles, and you're also growing pickling cucumbers, you can actually plant a companion planting of dill with the cucumbers and then market them together. If you're going to do this, you want to seed the dill about a week earlier than the pickling cucumbers. And dill is a fairly fast turnaround crop as well. It can be harvested at any stage from very small up into the point where the seed is mature. And there is a market for dill seed as well as for the foliage of the dill. The foliage of the dill is called dill weed. So both the weed and the seed are marketable products. So as far as growing dill, plant your plants 6 to 10 inches apart in rows that are 2 to 3 feet apart. It does make a fairly large, fairly tall plant at maturity. And again, as is the case with cilantro, you might consider succession plantings of dill so that you can have a longer harvest period. Generally pest-free. The only pest that I it's not really a pest, but the only issue that I sometimes see on dill is the larva of black swallowtail caterpillars. Now, as far as harvest and post-harvest possibilities with dill, you can harvest it as baby dill. And this picture here shows an example of baby dill. And this, the herb is harvested before flowering at this stage. It's stored at 30 to 35 degrees, again at high humidity. And again, it's a perishable product, so market it as quickly as possible. In fact, this example of baby dill, you can already see some yellowing on the foliage. The quality is beginning to suffer on this particular container of baby dill. You can also harvest dill when the stalks have flower heads on. And at this point, you cut or pull the stalks, bunch them together after the majority of the seeds have formed, but they're still green. And again, store them in cool temperatures, high humidity. This is the stage at which you want to harvest dill for use with dill pickles. And if you're using dill as a seasoning and other pickled products, again, there's lots of applications for that. And then if you're growing the dill as a seed crop, you want to harvest it when the seeds are ripe. Now with dill, the flowering habit is such that there's an initial large head, and then you have side heads that develop. And the large head, of course, will blossom first, and that will be the first head that ripens the seed. And if you want to harvest more than just that central head, you'll have to clip the large heads initially, and then come back perhaps a week or two later and clip the side heads when the seeds on the side heads are ripe. You don't want to leave the seed heads out too long because the seed heads will shatter and you'll lose the seed. Okay, do we have any questions on dill?
No dill questions. Nope.
Okay, now let's talk about parsley. And an interesting Latin name, Petroselinum crispum. It's a biennial. This means that you plant parsley from seed in 1 year, and then the second year, it produces flowers, and then it dies. So again, a 2-year life cycle. 2 types of parsley, curly leaf parsley and Italian flat leaf parsley, and you can see both of those types illustrated in this picture. As far as the culinary use of parsley, the Italian flat leaf type is favored, but both types are equally well suited for use as culinary herbs. Parsley can also be grown for the garnish market, and in that case, typically the curled or curly leaf parsley is what is grown. Parsley seed does not have a long period of viability, and it's a good practice to purchase new seed for each growing season. Parsley doesn't transplant easily. It should be direct seeded into fairly large containers if you're going to start seedlings before planting out, and then transplant when they're small. You want to space those transplant 4 to 8 inches apart. Space your rows 36 inches apart. You can plant parsley in both the summer, the fall, or the spring. The summer sowing is harvested in the fall. A fall sowing is overwintered and then harvested the following early spring. And spring sowings are harvested in the late spring through summer. So if your goal is to have parsley available for long periods of time, you can stagger these plantings and then have a harvest that runs from spring through late fall or even into the early winter. Space parsley plants 12 to 18 inches apart in the rows. Parsley plants are fairly small in the first year, but they become large plants in the second year. So that's why you need to allow this much space. Water is needed, fertilize pre-plant and after harvest. And parsley can be harvested as entire plants, or the leaves can be harvested individually, bundled, and then marketed as bundles of parsley leaves. And again, this picture we saw earlier, we saw the cilantro, but next to it is parsley plants. And in this case, it's Italian flatleaf parsley, where the plants were actually uprooted as fairly small plants and then bundled and then sold as entire plants. So again, you can pull stems from the plant and bundle together. Avoid picking yellow or pale leaves. You want to grade parsley as you harvest it, because the yellow or pale leaves will have off flavors. Package in poly bags and then refrigerate after harvest. Again, most herbs are best stored at 33 to 35 degrees F, and at high relative humidity, 95 to 100%. You have about a 2-week shelf life with parsley, but you'll know you've kept your parsley too long when you start to see yellowing on the foliage. Okay, any questions on parsley?
Yes. The question is, for container grown flat parsley, how is it best to overwinter it? And then some clarification, we are growing 1 to 2 plants at home.
Parsley is quite hardy, and you shouldn't have any difficulty overwintering it. It is helpful if you can move the container to a protected area in the garden, particularly protected from west or north winds, and perhaps even put a row cover or some light mulch, such as a leaf mulch, over the top. But again, parsley plants are quite hardy, and they should be able to endure all but the toughest Missouri winters.
All right, that's our only parsley question.
Okay, very good. Sage is our next herb. Again, it's Salvia officinalis. It is a short-term perennial. And yes, it's a perennial, but the experience of farmers with sage has been you get generally about 3 years of profitable production from a sage plant, and then it's time to replant that bed. A number of cultivars, extracta, Holt's mammoth, and then we have colored varieties. And if you look in this picture, you can see 3 examples of colored sage. Over on the right is golden sage, in the middle is tricolor sage, and on the left is purple sage. So again, these add interest to marketing. They all have very similar flavor profiles, but again, very interesting from the standpoint of the color of the foliage. This picture, of course, shows a more traditional sage. Generally, sage is established as transplants, and the transplants are frequently grown from seed, but they can also be grown from cuttings from established plants. If you're growing from seed, start the seed 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost. So here in Missouri, that would typically be sometime in late March. 2 to 3 seeds, a quarter-inch deep in individual containers, then thin them to 1 plant per container after they germinate. Sometimes sage germination is erratic. That's why you want to put several seeds into each pot. And it can be a challenge to transplant those little sage seedlings. So again, put multiple seeds in each individual container. Sage does best in full sun. This is another example of an interesting type of sage with the larger rounded leaves. It does best in well-drained soil. Once you've grown the seedlings or purchased the seedlings, transplant them outside after the last frost, spaced them 12 inches apart in rows that are 18 inches apart. And as we saw earlier, they will make a fairly sizable plant in a year's time. And they will survive for several years. Again, as I mentioned, 3 to 4 years, though, is about what you expect from a bed of sage. And if your goal is to be in continuous sage production over a long period of time, you want to be starting the next bed of sage about 2 to 3 years into the life of bed number 1, and then irrigate sage as needed. So with sage, you can harvest individual leaves, and this is frequently what's done the first year because it doesn't stress the plants excessively. In the second and following years, you can actually cut entire stems. You can actually cut these stems back to within 6 inches of the base of the plant. And you want to do this just as the blossoms begin to open. Sage has a lovely blue blossom, and it adds to the attractiveness of the bunches of sage. And you can sell sage as a fresh herb, but frequently it's hung upside down in bunches to dry, and then it's sold as a dry herb. Okay, do we have any questions on sage?
Not a sage question, but we do have one on parsley.
Yes.
Okay, it says, can I harvest parsley seeds and grow it again in the spring or fall, or will there be variability issues?
So parsley is much less prone to issues of variability. In fact, it's a pretty straightforward plant to save seed from. If you're going to save seed, obviously you have to have those plants in the garden for 2 years. And in the second year, they will blossom. They'll send up flowering stalks, they'll blossom, and then they'll set seed. And then you can collect that seed as it browns and dries. And then you'll use that seed then for starting the crop the following growing season.
All right, that's our only question right now.
Okay. Basil, I probably should have mentioned basil first because this is by far the leading herb from the standpoint of commercial production in Missouri. And, when I ask farmers about the profit potential for herbs, they say, well, there's basil and then there's everything else. And I don't know that that's entirely true. Certainly basil, cilantro, and mint are right up there at the top as far as profit potential. But the leading herb grown in Missouri is basil. It's an annual, particularly under Missouri growing conditions. And the dominant type that is grown is called Italian basil. And there's a number of cultivars of Italian basil. Genovese is the standard cultivar. Nufar is widely grown. In recent years, we've seen a serious issue related to basil downy mildew. And this is a disease that has the potential to wipe out a basil planting in very short period of time. And there has been a concerted effort to develop cultivars that have resistance to downy mildew. And the breeding program at Rutgers University has developed 3 cultivars, Devotion, Passion, and Prospera, which have resistance to downy mildew. And these would be excellent choices for a farmer who wanted to consider growing Italian basil. There's other types of basil to consider. Some of them have different colored foliage. You can see the purple basils in this particular picture. There are basils with different growth habits. The spicy globe, those are the basil plants in the lower right corner. Thai basil is a staple in Thai cooking. Basils that have unusual flavors, lemon and pine basil, for example, and cinnamon basil. So there are some interesting variations on the theme as far as basil. But again, the majority of basil that's grown and sold commercially in Missouri is Italian basil. Basil is seed propagated, and it can be direct seeded in the garden. The seeds are very tiny, and it can be a bit of a challenge to do a good job of direct seeding, but it can be done. The seeds should be planted a quarter-inch deep, 2 to 3 seeds per inch, in rows that are 18 inches apart. And then as the seedlings come up, they should be thinned to a spacing of about 4 to 8 inches apart. More frequently, though, basil is established from transplants, where the seed is sown indoors about 6 weeks before setting out. It's a very frost-sensitive plant, so you want to wait till the soil temperatures are above 60, and there's no risk of frost before setting it out. Plant, again, the seed a quarter-inch deep, keep at warm temperatures for best germination, and then transplant to the field when the seedlings have 3 to 4 sets of leaves, 4 to 8 inches apart in rows 18 inches apart. This is a picture of a really unique type of basil with the feathered, twisted leaves that are purple in color. Now, basil is a full sun plant and needs to be grown in full sun for the development of the richest flavor and aromatic profile. It does well in moderately rich soil. This one is a bit of an exception to the rule of thumb that herbs do better in less fertile soils. Basil, on the other hand, thrives in moderately rich soils. It's definitely not cold tolerant. Don't be in a hurry to plant basil out. Even a slight frost will destroy the plants. And even temperatures below 50 degrees will cause issues with the quality of the foliage. So don't plant basil too early. And if you're growing it as a late summer fall crop, harvest it before the cold temperatures arrive. It's also not drought tolerant and will need to be irrigated as necessary. Now, as far as harvest and post-harvest, once the plants have become established, you can harvest individual leaves. Typically, you want to harvest in the early morning when the temperature is cooler and before the leaves have wilted. You can then, when the plants are larger, you can do a full harvest. This is where you're cutting stems. You can cut the entire plant 4 to 6 inches above the ground, and this will then promote a regrowth for a second harvest. If you're picking individual leaves off, handle them carefully because they're easily bruised and they lose quality quickly. If you're handling them as bunches, bunch them carefully together and then place them into plastic sleeves, as we talked about with the mint, and hold them at cool temperatures. But in this case, we're not holding them at temperatures in the 30s. We're holding them at temperatures 50 degrees or above because they are so cold sensitive. And if you try to hold them at the same temperature you would hold something like cilantro or mint, you'll very quickly damage the leaves, and the result will be blackened leaves that are not marketable. Okay, any questions about basil?
No questions right now.
Okay. Thyme. So thyme is another herb that has commercial potential. It's a perennial, and in some cases a long-lived perennial. There are a number of interesting types of thyme, but from the standpoint of commercial production, most farmers are growing either winter or summertime, or they're growing creeping thyme. This is a picture of a bed of different types of thymes, and you can see the variation in the height of the plants, the growth habit, and the colors of the foliage. So there's lots of interesting thymes, but if your goal is to grow it as a commercial crop, you'll be focusing on winter thyme, summertime, or creeping thyme. This picture shows creeping thyme. Thyme is best established using transplants from cuttings or seed, and more frequently from cuttings than from seed. If you do grow it from seed, you want to start the seed in flats, indoors, 8 to 10 weeks before the last frost. It takes a long time to grow a thyme plant of any size. Sow them very shallowly. They're tiny, tiny seeds, and keep them moist until they germinate. And then they can be transplanted in individual containers when the plants have 4 true leaves. This picture shows wintertime, and thyme does best in full sun to partial shade. Now, partial shade is light shade. It's not deep shade. And in fact, the quality of the aromatics in thyme is actually improved by some protection from the heat of midday. Thyme does best in a light, well-drained soil. And after the last frost, that's, of course, when you're going to transplant them out. They make a plant of some size, so space them 6 to 8 inches apart in rows 12 to 18 inches apart. Now, you can actually pinch off the growing tips of some of the more upright growing types, and that will give you a bushier plant, and you'll have more leaves relative to the amount of stems that you harvest. The value in thyme is in the leaves, not in the stems. And yes, thyme is a perennial. It can be long-lived, but it's best if you divide or replace thyme plants after 3 to 4 years. They become quite woody and less productive if you don't divide them or in fact replace them after 3 to 4 years. Here's another shot of wintertime. Harvest or post-harvest. The first year you want to just do light harvests, and you really don't want to get into heavy harvests until the second and subsequent years. In subsequent years, you can harvest just as the flowers begin to open. You can cut the entire plant back to within 4 to 5 inches above the ground, bundle the stems together, and then sell them as fresh thyme or you can dry them and sell them as dried thyme. It's a very attractive product as a dried herb. And more and more farmers are drying thyme before sale. Do we have any questions about thyme?
No thyme questions right now.
Okay. Rosemary. So rosemary is a member of the mint family. It is a tender perennial. Now, again, in a warm climate, rosemary can be a very long-lived plant. But here in Missouri, just not hardy enough to survive winters reliably. Perhaps with protection, perhaps if grown in a cold frame or low tunnel or a high tunnel. But even in those settings, in extremely cold weather, rosemary will be damaged. A number of cultivars, Blue Boy and Spice Islands, are the most commonly grown ones as far as commercial production, but there's many different types of rosemary that can be grown. Some of them have interesting growth habits. Rosemary can be established from seed, but again, there's variability. If you start rosemary from seed, you'll have plants of different levels of aromatics and different types of growth habits. So it's more frequently grown from cuttings. If you are growing from seed, they can be grown in flats. If you're growing from cuttings, they can be grown and they can be rooted directly into small pots, 2.5 to 3 inch pots, and they root quite readily under mist. Keep the flats or the pots cool, 55 to 60 degrees, and keep them moist, but not soaked. And then if you're growing them from seed, transplant them to individual containers when the plants have 4 true leaves. Rosemary is definitely a full sun plant. It does best in a light, well-drained soil. They make large plants spaced from 18 to 24 inches apart. Excellent plant for container production, and particularly if you have a protected place in which to place the plants over the winter, this can be one way to grow rosemary as a perennial. But if you are growing it in the field, it's best grown as an annual. And again, I have down there will overwinter with protection in Southwest Missouri, but notice there's a question mark there. Cold winters, rosemary will succumb to cold temperatures. So harvest begins about 80 to 100 days after you've planted it from cuttings, or 120 to 180 days if you're growing it for bunching. Now, stem tips, that's where you're harvesting just the very tip, probably the top 3 to 4 groups of leaves. And rosemary leaves are opposite. So when you talk about leaves, you're actually talking about a pair of leaves. But if you're harvesting it in bunches, and again, frequently the market is interested in rosemary stems as a garnish or perhaps for use in skewers, that sort of thing. In that case, you're going to be harvesting about 120 to 180 days from planting. And it takes that long to develop a stem that is long enough to harvest as a bunch. And rosemary can be easily dried. Hang the small bunches of stems in a dry location out of direct sunlight for drying. Okay, any questions on rosemary?
Yes, we have one question. It says,
Yes.
With many of the herbs you mentioned, you specified the temperature and humidity that they're stored at. This would require some sort of commercial refrigeration unit, correct? And if so, where could you find these?
Yes, it does require a refrigeration unit. And small-scale farmers frequently start out with what's called a cool bot setup. And a cool bot is a piece of equipment that basically bypasses the thermostat in a standard window air conditioning unit. And so you can develop a small space, a room perhaps, or even something smaller that's insulated, and you place the window air conditioning unit in this space. You attach the cool bot, and this allows the unit to continuously run. And by doing this, you can actually develop temperatures that are within that 33 to 35 degree range that is suitable for cold storage of most herbs. And then you can regulate humidity with humidifiers or even with open containers of water to help raise the humidity to the level that it needs to be. So it can be done inexpensively, but you're correct. If you're going to be holding herbs for any length of time, you need to be able to do it under the right cold storage conditions.
All right, we have another question. It says, how long should the stem be for the rosemary stem for drying and storage?
So when I see rosemary being harvested as stems for bunching, the stems are typically 8 to 10 inches long, sometimes longer, but An 8 to 10 inch long stem, the leaves are all still good quality along the length of that stem, and it's long enough for a chef to work with, or it's long enough for you to bundle together, hang and dry, and then sell it as a dried stem, or even to remove the leaves from the stem and sell the leaves. So I would say 8 to 10 inches is what I would shoot for.
Okay, those are all the questions we have right now.
Okay, thank you. Lavender, a lot of interest in lavender these days. I'm involved in a project to help promote lavender as a profit center for our farmers, and I've just been amazed at how many people are interested in growing lavender. Lavender is a tender perennial. The lavenders as a group are divided into two broad categories. There's the angustifolia or English lavenders, and then there are what are called the ex intermedia lavenders. And under the English lavenders, we have cultivars like Munstead, Hidcote, Melissa Bowles, and Gina Davis. As far as the intermediate types, we have Grosso, Provence, and Dutch. And again, as a group, the intermediate types tend to be a bit hardier than the angustifolia types, but both types are adapted to growing in Missouri. They're best established as transplants from tissue culture or cuttings. Again, the name cultivars in particular do not come true from seed, so they're propagated vegetatively from tissue culture or cuttings. You can propagate from seed, but recognize that seed propagation yields variable plants. Let me go back one slide, and you'll notice in this field, this is a field where the plants were established from seed, and you notice lots of variability in the size of the plants, in the floriferousness of the plants, and even in the color of the blossoms. And that's because there is variability in lavender plants grown from seed. If your goal is a more uniform planting, then you'll want to grow with plants that are propagated from tissue culture or from cuttings. This is a picture of a newly established lavender planting. Notice the raised beds, notice the landscape fabric, and notice that the plants are growing in holes that have been burned in the fabric. Okay, again, very important to develop a planting system where the plants will not suffer from wet soils, because lavender very quickly succumbs if the soil is too wet. And again, just to reinforce that, well-drained soils are necessary for lavender production. The soil, in fact, should be a bit on the gravelly side. So thankfully here in Southwest Missouri, we can provide that. Make sure that it's not too acidic. Make sure it's not too alkaline. pH of somewhere around 6.5 is well suited for lavender production. A protected south-facing location is ideal. Lavender is tender, and in cold winters, it will suffer damage. This is a planting of lavender up near Columbia, and in this planting, the lavender is actually protected over winter from conditions by using individual covers over each plant. You can also use row covers that would cover an entire row of lavender. But again, important to consider some way to protect the lavender plants from cold temperatures. Another cultural issue that growers are considering is the use of what are called gravel beds. And these are beds where the majority of what the lavender is growing in is actually a gravel. And this provides, again, an environment that is light, well-drained, well suited for lavender. Lavender in its native habitat grows on very light, stony soils. And so by using gravel, this can actually encourage lavender production. We're still in the sort of the experimental phase of understanding the use of gravel beds in Missouri. But stay tuned. I think we'll see more and more farmers considering gravel beds under our growing environment. Space the plants 12 to 36 inches apart and rows 3 to 6 feet apart. This is about 4,000 plants per acre. This close-up shows the woven ground cloth that's placed around the lavender plants. The flowers are removed the first year. Irrigate is needed, but be very cautious about overwatering. I mentioned gravel bed production. We have some lavender farmers that are using powder bag production, again, in an effort to develop a very well-drained soil that is not overly wet. So from the standpoint of marketable products from lavender, the leading product is dried blossoms. And you can see in this crate bundles of dried blossoms. And in this case, the farmer was bundling together 25 stems and then drying them and then packaging them in a very attractive setting, as you can see there. The flower spikes are harvested on a dry, warm, sunny day just as the flowers begin to open. Okay, you have a much more attractive bundle if you try to catch it as very early in the flowering cycle. The bundles are hung to dry in a dry, well-ventilated space out of direct sunlight. You can market fresh blossoms, and they can be sold as a cut flower. They can also be sold as a flower that stands on its own merits as a cut flower rather than as part of a mixed bouquet. And then we see farmers who are interested in developing products from lavender. And these are typically based on oil or hydrosol that is distilled from the lavender plant and the lavender blossoms. And I'm not going to spend much time talking about this, but this is definitely a possibility. It does require specialized equipment to do the production. And I am hearing of groups of farmers who collectively purchase the distillation equipment to produce oil and hydrosols from their lavender crops. So I think we'll see more of this in the future. And lavender oil and lavender hydrosol is widely used in cosmetics and various medicinal preparations. So any questions about lavender?
We have one question. It says, to propagate from a cutting, should it be rooted in soil or water?
Typically, lavender cuttings would be rooted in a soilless mixture rather than in water. And these mixtures typically are made up of peat moss, perlite, perhaps some vermiculite. And the cuttings are placed in the mixture, and then it's placed into a mist setting that keeps them uniformly moist, but not too wet until they root.
All right, that's our question for now.
Okay. Now, some other herbs of interest. We're not going to talk about these at length, but I have seen all of these herbs offered for sale here in Missouri by farmers. Fennel, both, I perhaps see more of the vegetable form of fennel, the bulb type fennel rather than the type of fennel that's grown for its foliage and its seed. Lemon balm, the picture here is of lemon balm. Chives, we think of chives as a member of the onion clan, and it certainly is, but it's sometimes considered to be an herb as well. Bay. So bay is a tender, perennial, woody tree, but in a greenhouse environment, it can grow. And I know several farmers who are growing bay in greenhouses, harvesting the foliage and selling the leaves of bay. Horehound is sometimes grown and marketed. Catnip can be grown and marketed to cat enthusiasts. And then ginger and turmeric, perhaps more frequently thought of as vegetables, but they too can be grown as herbs, and then the roots marketed as a seasoning. Do we have any questions about any of these herbs?
Nope, no questions right now.
This is your chance, everyone, to dig a little deeper into any of these herbs.
Wait just a minute.
Okay, any questions?
No, not right now.
Okay, well, we can return to any of those if you'd like. Okay, so as far as sourcing, go
Sorry,
ahead.
Patrick, we have one question.
Go ahead, please.
It says, can lemon balm propagate from a cutting?
Lemon balm is easy to propagate from cuttings. It's also easy to propagate from stolons, as we saw with mint, or from divisions. And then lemon balm comes reasonably true from seed as well.
Okay, that's the questions we have.
Okay. As far as sourcing plant materials, you can certainly grow your own, especially if you're growing cuttings or propagating plants from cuttings or divisions or pieces of stolons. You can also purchase plant material, and from the standpoint of starting large-scale herb plantings, this is probably the more practical way, but make sure you deal with a reputable source. It can be in your interest to deal with a specialized herb nursery that understands the best propagation practices and production practices for herb nursery stock. Make sure the plants are of good quality, especially with perennial type herbs, and make sure that's the correct varieties. It's a little disappointing if your plan was to establish a bed of peppermint and discover that you got some other unknown type of mint. So again, these are all things to consider when you're sourcing your herb plants. Now, from the standpoint of marketing, this is one of the exciting things about herbs. There are lots of options from the standpoint of marketing an herb crop. Many farmers who are new to herb production will focus first on a farmer's market, and with good reason. A farmer's market is an established market. The people who buy at farmers markets are tuned into the qualities of herbs, and they appreciate the options or the opportunity to buy herbs. You can also market herbs at upscale restaurants. Again, creative chefs are always looking for sources of herbs. And in fact, it can be a profitable partnership when a farmer works with a restaurant that is looking for specific types of herbs and custom grows those herbs for the restaurant. Health food stores, again, the clientele at health food stores are definitely tied in to the qualities of herbs, especially medicinal herbs. Grocery stores frequently will be looking for sources for locally grown herbs. And then food manufacturing companies. Herbs are an ingredient in many, many different types of foods. And a food manufacturing company that is focused on local production may be searching for a source of an herb for a product that they're interested in producing. So all of these are opportunities for farmers to consider when it comes to marketing herbs. Now, in what form do we market herbs? As I went through the different herbs, you heard me frequently talking about fresh cut or fresh herbs, but there are other options for marketing herbs as well. Herb plants can be marketed as bedding plants. There's demand in the spring among home gardeners to purchase herb planting stock so that they can establish their own beds of herbs. And some farmers will grow herbs as bedding plants. Herbs can also be marketed as entire plants for use. And particularly for apartment dwellers and others who just don't have the space to grow the herbs, but have space perhaps for herbs in a container, they may be interested in buying a pot of herbs that they can take home and then use until that particular plant is used up. Fresh cut herbs, I've touched on that frequently in the presentation. Excellent market for many different types of fresh cut herbs. Dried herbs, those herbs that maintain and preserve their aromatic and flavor qualities as they're dried, can then be dried and marketed as dried herbs. And then we have a number of herbs that are important ingredients in value-added products. In fact, some cases, they are the value-added product. And let's touch on these here over the next series of slides. So again, live herbs in pots. Here we see a collection of different types of herbs that a farmer grew that they're offering for sale in the spring. Fresh cut, fresh live herbs. Looking at the picture on the right, these are herbs that were grown hydroponically, but they were lifted with their root systems intact. You can see at the bottom of the plastic bag in these pictures, you can see the root system of those herbs. And those herbs will last longer than a fresh cut herb. And then on the left, we see fresh cut herbs. Dried herbs. Now recognize that not all herbs will maintain their flavor when dried. And in fact, some herbs become essentially tasteless once they've been dried. So obviously there's very little market for those herbs, but other herbs maintain their flavor when the foliage or the stems are dried. In other cases, the seed, when it's dried, may be the marketable product. This is the case with herbs like fennel and dill and caraway and cilantro. Typically with dried herbs, you're going to harvest just before flowering. If you're harvesting the foliage and the stems, the new growth has the best flavor. Harvest on a sunny day at mid-morning after the dew is dried, but don't wait too long because you don't want the herbs wilting down. And in fact, by mid to late afternoon, a good part of the aromatics in herbs have been lost. So harvest early in the day, but harvest after the dew is off the plants. If you're going to dry them with a dehydrator, it needs to be done at low temperature. It's very easy to burn off the aromatics if you try to dry at too warm of a temperature. So using a forced air dehydrator, dry at 95 to 110 degrees. And then once they're dried, store them under cool, dry conditions in sealed containers. And generally, herbs are best stored in dark conditions because sunlight, the UV rays and sunlight will bleach out the color of herbs and sometimes adversely affect the aromatics in the herbs as well. So cool, dry, and I will add dark conditions, best way to store herbs. And then value added, there's lots of opportunities for value added herb products. And again, sometimes they're the main event, dried herbs and herb mixtures, herb infused salts and herb teas. These are all examples of value added where the herb is the main event. But herbs are also an important ingredient, things such as rubs, baked goods, many, many different types of prepared foods. Herbs are an important ingredient. And then we can also distill and extract products, oils or hydrosols. Lavender, a good case in point, but there are other herbs that you can do that with as well. The mints, for example, or rosemary, you can can extract the oils and market those. And then the oils, hydrosols, and sometimes the whole herbs can be used in cosmetics, soaps, lip balms, various types of personal care type products. So again, lots of opportunities for value-added herb products. Now, as far as resources, University of Missouri Extension has a guide sheet on growing herbs at home. But if you really want to delve into the commercial scale production of herbs, I recommend these two publications, the Growing Herbs as a Cash Crop from North Carolina State University and Getting Started with Culinary Herbs from Penn State University are excellent, excellent resources for those who are new or even those who have been growing herbs for some time. So check those out. Good information there on how to grow these interesting and exciting plants as a profitable crop on your farm. And with that, that is the end of my prepared remarks, but we have plenty of time for any questions. So now would be a great time to add any questions to the chat. Anna, how many people do we have on the call?
Currently, we have 20.
Okay, I think that's a small enough group that if you'd like to unmute and ask a question verbally, that would be great. I don't think we'll have too much confusion doing that. So if you have a question you'd like to ask, feel free to unmute and ask that question.
Okay, we are actually in a webinar right now, so our participants won't be able to unmute.
Oh, we don't have that
their
option.
video.
I'm sorry.
That's
sorry.
Okay, no worries. But we still do have the Q&A button at the bottom. Feel free to put any questions you have about this presentation or herbs in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen.
I know if you share my enthusiasm of herbs, and I assume you do because you're with us tonight, you may have some questions. So please type them into the chat and we will tackle them, or into the Q&A and we will tackle them.
All right, kind of a housekeeping question. Will this presentation be available later on? It will be. It'll be on our YouTube agriculture workshop playlist. The link I just put in the chat, so feel free to check it out there. That'll be up by the end of the week. I've also put in the workshop survey for after this workshop is complete, if you take a few minutes to fill that out, along with SCG's website and social media. So housekeeping side, now back to herb questions. We have one from Marty, which says, can bay be grown in containers? And can it be grown inside or overwintered?
What type of herb are you talking about, Marty?
Bay?
Bay. Oh, yes, of course. Bay can be grown as a houseplant. In fact, I've grown a bay tree as a houseplant for about 10 years now. And periodically, when I need bay leaf in a recipe, I'll pick a leaf off. So yes, it can, but it is a tender plant. It does great outdoors during the spring, summer, and fall, but move it back indoors when the night temperatures are starting to drop below 50 degrees. And don't be in too much of a hurry to move it out back in the spring. Wait till it's definitely warmed up in the spring.
All right, do we have any other questions?
Any questions at all? Everything is fair game tonight.
All right, Katie says, how often should perennials like sage be replaced? I've heard that at least every 7 or 8 years.
So the experience of farmers with sage is it's probably going to be more frequently than that. Typically 3 to 4 years on sage. Other perennials are longer lived. Mint is a good example. Now a mint bed will benefit from division or just thinning out periodically, but a mint bed should endure easily for 10 years. But some of the herbs that are indeed perennials just don't have a long period of time in which they remain productive and profitable. And in that group, I would list thyme, I would list sage, and I would list oregano and marjoram. All of those, a bed probably will last about 4 to 5 years, and then it's time to replace it.
All right. Shreya asks, can sage be propagated from cuttings?
Yes, sage can be propagated from cuttings.
All right, do we have any other questions? All right, Leah says, I have chives that are in their 2nd year and are now flowering. What, if anything, can I do with them?
Oh, well, if the chives aren't flowering, of course, you can still enjoy the foliage. I would try dividing them. And even in the 2nd year, sometimes chive clumps will become a little bit crowded. And by dividing them and spreading them out a bit, I think you'll see an increase in flowering next year.
Okay, I think, let me read that again, just to make sure I read it right. Okay, her chives are in their second year and are flowering. They're currently flowering.
And they are flowering. I'm sorry. I thought they were not flowering. You know, the flowers on chives can be eaten as well. Very tasty. I like them in salads.
It's an easy fix then. Eat them in a salad. Jeanette says, can dill grow inside?
Dill can be a challenge inside. It really does better in the open garden. It can be grown under protection, you know, high tunnel, low tunnel, that sort of thing. But when I try to grow dill inside, almost invariably I end up with a plant that doesn't have much in the way of flavor. It really does better in the outside environment where it has full sun and, again, just exposed to outside conditions.
All right. The next question says, when we want to replace a plant after a few years, does it mean to start fresh from seeds or to buy a new plant?
In some cases, you can take the original plant and divide it and rejuvenate it. And that's the case with plants like mint, for example. In other cases, and sage would be a good example, you just want to discard the original plant and start with a new plant, either from seed or from cutting.
All right. Do I have any other questions?
Any other questions? I will mention that in the Springfield area, there is a lovely herb garden at the Springfield Botanical Center that's maintained by the Springfield Herb Society. So I encourage you to get out into that garden and enjoy those herbs. And if you're ever in St. Louis, the Missouri Botanical Garden has a world-class herb garden. In fact, they have several herb gardens, one of which is a very formalized knot type garden, and the other is a more naturalized type herb garden. So we have several places in Missouri where we can see nice examples of herb gardens. If you're in the Kansas City area, Powell Gardens has a nice herb garden as well.
Very good. All right, well, we're waiting to see if there are any other questions. Just one more reminder, after we go off of this webinar, there will be a pop-up with a link to a post-workshop survey. If you could take a few minutes to fill that out, we'd really appreciate it, as CG uses that in our reporting to the USDA and to provide more workshops to all of you in the future. So that link will be in a pop-up after we leave and then is also in the chat currently. All right, a couple more questions here. It says, does Patrick run a formal hands-on class to learn about herbs?
You know, when we get back into an era of in-person classes, yes, I've done a number of hands-on classes. And I'll mention too that there is the Springfield Herb Society. And if herbs is a passion, that's a great group to join because you'll be with kindred spirits. They have a monthly meeting and a program at that meeting that's very informative. I've spoken there several times and always enjoy interacting with the members of the Springfield Herb Society. So check them out. And that's a great place to attend more classes. And if you get interested and join the association, you'll have a chance to work in their herb garden there at the Botanical Center.
Nice. All right. Next question says, how many types of thyme are good for culinary use?
You know, almost any type of thyme can be used for culinary use, but from the standpoint of commercial potential, chefs expect the flavor profile that you would see in wintertime, summertime, or creeping time. That's why I mentioned those three. When you get into some of the more esoteric thymes like lemon thyme or orange thyme or cinnamon thyme, those flavor profiles are a little more unexpected. And, you know, perhaps the chef or someone using it would not mind that. But if you're looking for the more traditional, classical flavor of thyme, you'll want to work with something like wintertime or summertime.
A side question, are the wintertime, summertime, and curling time?
Creeping time.
Creeping time, are those the three types that grow best in Missouri as well?
You know, almost all of the thymes will grow well in Missouri. Again, assuming that you've provided them with that light, well-drained, moderately fertile soil, they'll do well. That bed that I showed you in the presentation is at the Springfield Botanical Center. And that bed was established perhaps 8 years ago, and it's doing great.
Okay, very good. Next question asks, how does cilantro do inside?
Cilantro is a bit like dill. In fact, I would say perhaps it has a bit more potential for inside production, but most of these herbs like dill, like cilantro, if you grow them indoors, you'll expect the flavors to be a bit more muted. You just can't provide as much sunlight indoors, and the growing conditions indoors typically aren't as conducive to the development of aromatics as they are outside. But I don't want to discourage you from trying it. And especially if your goal is to have some cilantro in the middle of the winter, why not give it a try? What might work would be starting the cilantro in pots outdoors in the fall, and then moving the pots indoors as the temperature gets, the temperatures get cold, and then you can enjoy the harvest of cilantro from that pot.
Very good. All right. Do we have any other questions?
Okay, any other questions? Well, if not, we'll bring our workshop to a close. I want to thank everyone for joining us, and I appreciate all the questions and the comments. It's kind of fun when you lead a workshop and you realize that your attendees share your interest and your passion. And it's been great fun for me tonight, and I hope that you've enjoyed it as well. Please feel free to reach out if you have questions that come up as we move ahead. And as Anna mentioned, the presentation will be posted for future viewing. So thank you so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you, Patrick. Have a good night.
Thank you.